Hello and welcome to Finextra TV. I'm Alex Lippic. You join us here in Lisbon for EBAday 2024. And I'm very pleased indeed to be joined on the sofa by Roland Brandli of SmartStream and Zennon Kapron of Kapronasia. Welcome to you both.
Hi.
It's great to see you. Zennon, I'm going to come to you first, if that's all right. Tell us a bit about this report that you've recently published.
Well, this report that we looked at basically was operational excellence in real-time payments. And I think when we look at real-time payments globally, it's an incredible increase. I mean, in 2023, we're about 266 billion real-time payments around the world, which was a 43% increase from the previous year. And so what that represents in the actual number of payments is about 27% of all the payments globally are now real-time payments. So it's an incredible transition, and it's a obviously very important part of how money moves around the world now, from B2B payments to individual payments to remittances. People expect that real-time element to their payments. I think what was really interesting about the report, though, was the fact that banks really aren't ready for this. For many years, we've been talking about real-time payments, and obviously in places like Europe and the UK, we've had real-time payments for oftentimes over a decade. And so banks are kind of thinking through, okay, how can we make these more profitable? And that's always been one of the big questions in the industry is how do we make money from this? But I think many of them are thinking about the top line rather than the bottom line. So they're thinking about, okay, how can we charge more? How can we do more value-added services? But there's a lot that can be addressed in the bottom line as well. Exceptions are incredibly expensive, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But I think that was one of the big surprises of the report, was that banks really have a lot more work to do in this space.
Sure. You've touched on the surprise. Is there anything you can add to that, do you think, Roland, in terms of the report?
Well, I think what's surprising is that, whilst this technology has been available for a while, you really see that in Europe, the adoption rate is actually a lot more conservative. So, in Europe, they're talking about moving from 6 to 7% instant payments to 13%. And that's regarded as quite a jump. You look at other regions, as Zennon just mentioned, they're growing much faster. And they're growing much faster because they tend to want to innovate more, and they're waiting less. And so what you find is they're doing it for the opportunity. When we look at what's happening in Europe and things like what the ECB is regulating, you find not only are they slower, but they're all waiting for the ECB to regulate, and they're losing a lot of that initiative because the ECB is actually really quite fascinating, because whilst they're mandating instant payments should be used across Europe, they're also mandating that the costs are not allowed to rise. They have to be just as cheap as other payments or cheaper. Now, if you'd taken a more of a proactive approach to this, you probably wouldn't have had that mandate come into place. Right? So I think it's a very interesting situation where you've really got to say, areas like Asia Pac, areas like the US, even Africa has moved faster than Europe, which is surprising.
You've mentioned, you've touched on some of the opportunities there. What do you identify as possibly the biggest challenges that financial institutions are facing at the moment in the industry? I'll come to you on that one, Roland.
Well, I think the biggest challenges are, there's an inherent reluctance to invest in technology, but technology is the answer. Yeah. And I think the challenge that a lot of banks will face is if they don't step up, they'll have to step out because other people will step in, fintechs. Yeah. So I find it's that mindset of understanding that having an operation is not a cost, it's an opportunity. Yeah. And I think that a lot of banks still find very challenging to understand. And then, payments in itself is that largest point of contact that any bank has with its customers. I was speaking to a lot of people today, and I sort of said, well, when was the last time your client relationship manager contacted you? Most people don't even know their client relationship, let alone get contact with them every 3 months. Well, you get contact with your bank statement once a month, and contact with every payment you make. So it really is actually your calling card of how good you are. And I think that's the next thing that we have to understand banking is changing. It's always been about products banks have offered, and now they're going to have to learn that those products are much more, or have to be much more customer-centric. It's not about what they want to offer, it's about what the customer wants to use.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look back at the banking industry maybe 20 years ago, it was, you felt honored to go into the branch. You're like, oh, thank you bank for banking me, and it was kind of a privilege. But now you're spoiled for choice, right? If you want to move money anywhere around the world, you have the banks themselves, which many are innovating. I mean, you have DBS in Singapore that you can move money anywhere around the world for free in most of the major currencies. But then you have the other players, the third-party PSPs that are coming in to do that. And I think that customer experience and that instant element of things is really important, and that's what the expectation is going forward.
And I think that's also where you find this entire subject that we approached in the report around handling exceptions. So I think where it plays a big factor is in the report that we did together, and that was the importance of time. So when you look at payments when they're correct, as I was saying, it goes through in a couple of minutes. But when they go wrong, it's amazing how much time it takes to fix. So about 70% of problems on payments take more than 5 days to resolve. All right? And so you've got to ask yourself, if you're a customer with the experience like I've had in the Middle East, in the last 4 years, I don't think a payment has ever taken much more than 1 or 2 minutes to go through. Is how do you explain to that same customer when something goes wrong, oh, well, that's taking us 5, 8, 9 days? Because as a customer, the only impression you get is it's incompetent. You don't understand why it's wrong, yeah? You multiply that time it takes to the difficulty it is nowadays dealing with banks as a customer. I sometimes make the joke, at the beginning with the call centers, it was difficult enough going through the 99 options. I just had to explain to someone, I really do not like their chatbot. And they asked me why. And I'm sort of, well, I have to speak its language. If I don't use the right words or the right, way of saying things, it doesn't understand me. So now I've got double frustration. I've got a payment which isn't going through and somebody I can't really communicate with. So I think that effect of getting that under control, being much more professional about how you handle it, bringing in more automation is really important. And that also, I think, Zennon, you had in your report, it was really very clear. It's not just about being slow, which is the reputation part. It's the cost, right?
Yeah, I mean, studies have shown that the average exception costs about $50 per case. And so when you think about the number of exceptions, SWIFT processed, I think, about 5 billion messages in 2022. And between 3 to 5% of those are exception messages. And so that's 100 million to 200, 300 million messages that are all about payment exceptions. So you multiply that times $50 every time, it's a huge cost. And again, it goes back to the way that banks need to be looking at this, because their focus should be on customer service and the profitability that comes from that, but they don't put enough time into the cost of these exceptions and the opportunities to be gained there.
It's such an interesting insight that you're sharing with me, and it's an education, isn't it, as well? And you're saying that effectively the customer is paramount, and it's important to see it from their perspective, like you mentioned, Roland. Zennon, that leads me nice on to my final question. I'm going to come to you if I may. Instant payments, looking forward as best you can, how do you foresee them changing in the future?
I think the fundamentals of instant payments are there, right? Instant or near instant payments that can go anywhere domestically and increasingly cross-border. I think within what we're seeing a little bit more is more integration within the region. So in my area in Singapore, the ASEAN region is starting to consolidate its payment networks into one seamless cross-border network. It'll probably take more time, and it's not as easy as it was to do here in Europe. But I think that integration, that cross-border integration will be there. But competition continues to increase because we have these nationalized payment switches that facilitate real-time cross-border, but then you have the DBSs and you have the WISEs and people that are not relying on that instant infrastructure but are still providing that instant experience. And so I think the complexity around this will increase, the competition will increase, but growth of real-time payments will only increase in the future.
Well, it's a lot of food for thought, and it'll be really interesting to see how things develop moving forwards. But Roland, Zennon, thank you both so much for giving up your time to speak with us. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.